of the times that he was involved in working, he would sing. And one of the songs that he used to sing when he was up working in the storeroom, preparing stock to come down for the beginning of the week, he would sing a song similar like this. He would go, la 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 la. And similar songs, then he'd sing, Hey Yuchnem, Hey Yuchnem, which reminded him of perhaps the time that he lived in Russia, and he was so happy working that nothing was ever a burden. I never heard my Abba ever complain about working. He would, at times during the year, he would be dressing a window. Dressing a window means that there were two shop windows in the biggest shop that we had, and I'm talking probably in the years 38, 40, 41, during the war years, and he would dress the shop window with artwork that he produced himself, tickets that he produced himself, and display the merchandise in the window to attract customers. I remember on one occasion he'd bought some children's dresses, little dresses, and at that time Shirley Temple was a very sought after idol for children when she performed in the movie theatres. And what he did was he got hold of some pictures of Shirley Temple, put them on a stand, and dressed the dress that showed Shirley Temple's face and the dress below, and the whole window was full of Shirley Temple dresses, and they were probably 1 and 11pence or 2 and 11pence, very cheap cotton dresses, and of course that was a big hit. Having been successful with that, on one occasion he thought he'd put Charlie Chaplin's face on some aprons. Well, that was a big flop. That didn't work at all. Nobody wanted to really be proud of wearing a Charlie Chaplin apron, so he discarded that window very quickly. And he'd work in those windows. There were two of them, one on the men's side of the of the shop and one on the ladies' side of the shop. And particularly at Christmas time, before Christmas, he'd do up the shop, and he had all sorts of tinsel and bright things, balloons perhaps, to brighten up that window to attract customers. And he'd work until 11 or after 11 o'clock at night, singing away and happy with the pins that he put in the display, because at the back of the window would be soft material where you could put tacks and put pins and display the merchandise in that manner. Okay. During the course of my studies in Narrabri at school, one of the subjects that I did for the intermediate certificate and for the leaving certificate was music. And music, you had to do a theory exam as well as a practical exam, and the practical violin exam I had to go to Gunnedah, which was about 60 miles away, with ABBA, because there weren't enough students studying the violin, and we travelled to Gunnedah for that occasion. But when I had to do the theory exam, coincidentally it happened to be on a Yom Kippur day, and because it was part of my examination, there was nothing I could do to avoid doing that exam on that day. But the nun who was supervising the theory exam that I did knew it was Yom Kippur, and she had on the desk in front of her a glass of milk and some biscuits. in an attempt to tempt me to break my fast and partake of the biscuits by having milk and biscuits. And she kept reminding me during the course of that exam, which lasted about an hour and a half or two, would I like to have some biscuits? Would I like to have some milk? And I kept shaking my head. There's no way I would break the fast. It was bad enough that I was doing an exam on the holy day. So it just showed me afterwards that really they were, in a way, quite nasty, not allowing. One of the things that happened too was that I had a choice of playing the piece in the exam. Either it was, I think I might have spoken about this before, about Kol Nidre and Ave Maria. I may have spoken about it before, but there was a choice of Kol Nidre, Baruch's Kol Nidre, and I chose that to play, and the nun said, well, she's not going to teach me that unless I learn Ave Maria, Gounod's Ave Maria. And for me, they were both lovely pieces. I couldn't see anything wrong with learning Ave Maria as well. So I agreed. It wasn't a problem for me, but obviously it must have torn at her soul to think that I chose Kol Nidre, and she wasn't going to have any part of that unless I learnt Ave Maria, and I thought that was really quite funny. When Seema and I lived in Melbourne during 1948, the year that Israel was founded. After the Habanim camp, we both decided we're not going back to Narrabri because we don't want to live among non-Jewish people anymore, and we loved being amongst Jewish people, and Abba hadn't decided to move from Narrabri yet, although he must have been seriously thinking about it. But during our stay in Melbourne, we mixed very much with the Habanim crowd, boys and girls, and enjoyed the meetings that we had, the Zionist meetings we had in Carlton, in Drummond Street, Carlton. And Seema stayed with a family, I just forgot the name. I forgot the name. And Rosenkrantz family, and I stayed at a place called Wachtel's, which was like a boarding house, and we just didn't want to go back to live in Narrabri at all. Abba used to come every few weeks to see us because he missed us and wanted to see how we were getting on, and but eventually, and during that time there was a play coming to Melbourne with Laurence Olivier and I forgot the name of the actress. Anyway, we slept in Collins Street all night to queue up for tickets for this. Vivian Lee was the lady's name, and we queued up in the street in the winter, in the cold weather, in our sleeping bags for the opportunity to get tickets for this particular play. But later when I used to be in Melbourne during that time, I used to go out to the Hakshara because the people that the young people that I one second, and we were very keen. I was keen to go and join my Chavarim, who were planning to go to Israel on a kibbutz. I think it was Kfar Hanassi, and I'd bought my rubber boots. I was planning to go, and but in the meantime, Abba came from Narrabri to inform us that he'd bought a business in Sydney, and would I help him establish the business and help him move from Narrabri to Sydney, because it would have been difficult for him to do that. Of course, I agreed, but I took my rubber boots with me just in case, because when that was all finished I was going to go. In the meantime, it so happened that quite a few of my friends, Chavarim, who went to Israel, and while in the course of helping Abba move from Narrabri to Rawson Chambers, they came back. So the enthusiasm for going sort of diminished, and I helped Abba pack up goods from the shop and send the excess stock on to Sydney. And I looked after the shop. I was 18 years of age, and I looked after the Narrabri shop on my own. The family were already living in Sydney. Seema joined them as well, and we came back to live in Sydney. But every few months, Abba would come. This has been on for about a year and a half, maybe two. By the time Abba found a customer through Rawson Chambers, which was a wholesale place selling merchandise to hawkers and to little shopkeepers, he found it difficult to adjust to that type of business rather than the retail business that he was used to. But eventually we did find a customer through Rawson Chambers, a hawker, and he decided that he could afford only a certain amount of stock, so the excess stock was packed up, and we left Narrabri forever. A year and a half later, floods came through that town in 1951, 3 foot through the town, and in 1956 they came 6 foot through the town. So we were very fortunate that all those years we never really had floods through the shop like the people that followed us had. One of the things that I was always grateful to Abba for, and I mentioned this to him, that in latter years after I'd established Best and Less, was I went to Abba, and Abba was a bit annoyed that he was quite upset that I'd actually left him, but Rawson Chambers, when we were working there, during those years, 48, 49, merchandise was very difficult to get hold of. We were just out of the war years. Factories weren't really in full speed here. There were a few, but merchandise was very scarce and very difficult to get. I remember one of the first items that we did buy from a manufacturer in Melbourne was socks, men's socks. And they were made really out of scraps of yarn, and they looked to me like jail socks with round stripes on them. They were 48 shillings a dozen, and I think they cost us 42 shillings, and we sold them for 48 shillings, and we only got an allocation of 20 dozen. So it was very difficult. People wanted to buy the lot, and then we wouldn't have any for the other customers who were either Lebanese immigrants who coming off the boat to try and make a living and going door to door. So really, Abba was supplying the people that similar to what he was when he first arrived in this country and went hawking. So he became a supplier of hawkers and small shopkeepers, and business was really quite good if you could get the merchandise, and he appealed to people that he knew that supplied him when he was in Narrabri, and we were lucky enough to get the Nile Industries supported us with men's singlets and underwear and t-shirts and things like that. And we used to have to buy cabbage. Cabbage wasn't a vegetable. Cabbage was the excess stock that a maker-up of goods would be cunning enough to quote so many yards to a dozen, and he would keep 2 or 3 of those yards of fabric for himself, so that with pillowcases, for example, Abba would be able to pick up 40 or 50 dozen pillowcases, which was actually cabbage, excess stock, which the person who had these sheets made up wouldn't have missed, because the fellow who made them up would have stolen, if you like, 2 or 3 inches off every sheet, made them a little bit shorter, so that out of the extra fabric that was left, he was able to make some pillowcases which he would sell to us or to others, and that was what cabbage was, and it was a very sought after commodity because they were really quite cheap, a good quality and cheap. But they were in the backyards of little manufacturers that existed at that time. Merchandise was so difficult to get. We had to pay promptly. Actually, we paid in advance for some merchandise just to be able to get things to put in the shops. It's very difficult to understand that in this day and age, where there's so much merchandise around, people keep chopping prices to be able to move it. In those days, you could get a little more for the merchandise because it was in such short supply. And during those years, well, 51 was the beginning of the Korean War, and prices had jumped enormously. I remember there was an Alroy shirt, an open-neck shirt, which I used to wear to work. We used to sell those for about 7 shillings and 6pence. And when the Korean War started, the price jumped to 12 and 6pence wholesale. So you can imagine what was happening. Merchandise was very jumped in price because there was a shortage of cotton. Wool, I think, was 10 shillings a pound. No, it was 20 shillings a pound for a pound in those days, whereas not long before it was about 10 shillings a pound. So you can imagine how things had changed. But it became a boom time, and the 50s saw good times for Abba. And he, having got rid of Narrabri, I worked in the shop and Seema worked in the shop until Seema met Arnold in Melbourne, Arnold Lederman, and not long after she married and she went to live in Narrabri, and I kept working with Abba for 17 years.
She went to Melbourne, didn't she?
Yes, she went to Melbourne. Yes. And Seema was very happy. She'd met her. I remember her telling Abba that Arnold took her around to meet different members of Parliament with whom he had a knitting mill, a weaving mill. He started a small weaving mill. A very energetic young man was Arnold, and I remember when Seema came back, having met Arnold, that she said to Abba, "Well, Abba, he's a very hard-working man, just like you." I remember when Seema finally married, and we all went down for the wedding, and it was a lovely wedding. Leo Rosner, who was in the film of what's the name of that film? The Holocaust, was it? Schindler's List. Oh. In Schindler's List, he was he played the piano accordion in Schindler, and he was one of the original people, and he played at Seema's wedding. I never heard music like that. It was absolutely wonderful. And sitting up on the table with Abba, I said to Abba, looking down at the crowd and how happy Seema was, to me she was like a Cinderella dream had come true. Seema, who was really quite a emotionally deprived child, and my mind went back to how she had to wash the dishes in the laundry in the dark with candle lights, and we didn't have hot and cold running water in the house, and we had difficulties with baths and hot water and so on. And Seema was really quite an adult child. She was but she took everything inwards, and we didn't really get on well with her stepmother. But despite all that, Seema having married Arnold, and finally we were sitting there, I said to Abba, "This is a long way from Narrabri, Abba," And I remember when Seema had her first little house with Arnold, a little picket fence and flowers growing in the garden. She was like a princess, and she never looked back. She was so happy, and she finally had 6 children, and they all were brought up very Jewish, and I know her life had changed immensely having met Arnold. When we'd moved from Narrabri to Rawson Chambers, and Abba was in Narrabri looking after Narrabri, and Seema and I were looking after Rawson Chambers. I'm not too sure if Seema was there or not, but I know I was there, and a fire had started, and I knew that Abba had kept in a little suitcase. I was only, I think, 18 or 19. He kept in a suitcase up at the back, hidden, was a little suitcase full of cash. When the fire had started, the fire brigade people were running around every floor telling everybody to leave. Well, I didn't have too much time, but I climbed up the ladder in the back of that shop to retrieve the little suitcase, because I know that was, if that would have gone in the fire, it would have been a disaster for the family. So at that time I was staying at a place called it was a mansion house, or it was a big hotel, a cheap hotel, and I hugged that suitcase, and I rang Abba from the in Narrabri, and just stayed in that room because I was fearful to be walking around the streets with a suitcase like that. It was only a small school case, but nevertheless that really was the lifeline for Abba, and if the stock would have gone, that's bad enough, but not to have any cash to replace with was so quick thinking. I grabbed that suitcase and hung onto it all day and until Abba arrived the following morning. There were no planes in those days, and he came by train, a 16-hour trip from Narrabri. So you can imagine the panic that would have had. And I think Abba was really quite grateful that I'd had the foresight, and really the timing of the fire was such that that I was fortunate to be in the building. There was actually some coins underneath the counter where we used to serve from, and when we went back after the fire, of course those coins were all missing, they were gone. So I was very, very fortunate in that instance. During the course of trading, there were a lot of traders in that building. It was a 5-story building, and there were quite a number of Jewish little wholesalers, all competing with one another, some having similar merchandise, some having different merchandise, and the hawkers would come in from out in the different country towns to come and shop. I built up quite a reputation amongst the customers that we had, in as much as if I knew there was a very good line selling, I wouldn't tell them to buy a lot of it, but I would say, well, why don't you try a dozen of those or half a dozen? We can get you more if you ring up. And so it was a policy that I had within my own psyche that I wanted them to be successful, and I wanted to give them lines that they would be successful with. On the other hand, Abba would be trying to push to them to get rid of a few of the what we call buvel, stuff that was very difficult to sell. Even though the price was cheap, they might have tried some, but they valued their little bit of capital that they had to try to make a living, and they really needed fast-selling merchandise. I, on the other hand, was an idealist, and I wanted to be certain that the people would be successful and sell good selling merchandise. But perhaps Abba was right to try to get rid of, you got to get rid of it in some way. So he did make price reductions on the stuff that he wanted to get rid of. But I was sort of idealistic about wanting to make sure that the customers had top selling merchandise, and they'd always ring me up to say, well, they called me Bill. They said, Bill, what do you suggest? And I would suggest always these top-selling lines that I knew were successful. When we came back from Melbourne to live in Sydney, Abba previously bought a home some years back, and he bought a home in Bondi, but the times were such that you couldn't put out tenants because they were protected. So he bought another home in another part of Bondi and had those tenants move to the other home so he could live in the home that he'd bought. In those days, a home in Imperial Avenue cost £1,000, which was about $2,000. In today's money, I would say that that home in 2001 is worth about $800,000. So it just shows you the price and how prices had moved. Abba must have bought that home in the 40s, just perhaps during the war, or yes, I would say perhaps during the war, between 40 and 45. Anyway, when we came to Sydney, we had to start to make new friends, because we'd made some friends in Melbourne having lived there for 6 months, and we joined Habanim again and went along to some meetings. I didn't really know anybody as such, but once I was in Habanim, then there was a group of friends that we used to mix with. But having reached an age of 18 or 19, Habanim had very strict rules about continuing on unless you made a commitment to go to Israel. You really couldn't belong anymore. So a Zionist organisation called ZYL was formed. Seema also joined that, and we made a number of friends there. As time passed by, there were a few friends that got together, and we used to go to Cyril and Leon and Esther Smith's home, and they were really like a home away from home. Unfortunately, we weren't encouraged by Sonny to have visitors at home. I thought that having moved from Narrabri to Sydney, that we would have a different type of lifestyle. At least we could have our Jewish friends come home. But for whatever reason, Sonny didn't see fit to or encourage us to have friends. So we more or less were happy to be at other people's homes, and the Smiths made us always welcome. Well, at the Smiths there was Leon Wise and Michael Cohen and a number of people. We used to go out on weekends. We'd go to youth concerts. We'd go to Pasadena where they had afternoon tea dances. We'd see each other during the week at different meetings, and so it was really quite a very nice group of people. Leon was living with John Davis in Wild Street, Potts Point, and when the Davises went overseas, we used to go up to his penthouse and enjoy the company of people, played Scrabble. Leon was quite domesticated and would make us a wonderful afternoon tea. We'd go to the Lewiniks, who were very hospitable to Czechoslovakian young immigrants who didn't have parents, and there were some people like that in the community, and amongst those people I felt quite at home because they spoke a little Yiddish and I could speak Yiddish, so we had a very common language, and whether most of the people were immigrant children, not I would have been the only one amongst them having been born in Australia. We found it difficult to, I hadn't actually met any particular girl that I could say would that enabled me to think about getting married or something, because I didn't earn very much, and I it didn't sort of strike me as a serious thing to get married, but I hadn't actually met anybody. That we were quite happy to be in the group, but some of them started to go out with different girls on a serious basis, and there were three of us that sort of hung out together. That was Benny Green, Grungrass, and Michael Cohen and myself. We'd play tennis, we'd go to a movie. Sure, we'd ring up girls to go out with, but there was nobody that I'd ever met that was, I could say I was serious about. But on one occasion, I said to Benny Green, I said, Ben, why don't we go up to the mountains and just have a weekend up there? And on that occasion, Benny and I left Friday afternoon around 5 o'clock, and we drove up to the mountains, and and I said to Ben, you know, why don't we call into this guest house, a Jewish guest house, that we can have a Shabbos meal? And he said, okay. So we arrived around about 7 o'clock, and it was getting dark, and I knocked on the door, and a religious Jewish man with a long beard came to the door, and he asked what we wanted, and I asked, could we have a Shabbos meal? Well, it must have seemed a bit strange for him, two young men asking for a Shabbos meal. He said, sure, and we came in, and we sat down. I think we were the only two there, but I noticed in the room, there were in the dining room, there was a group of elderly men and women all sitting together at a table, and the women had tzichel, like scarves on. And I asked the man if we could have candles, and I asked could we have a couple of yarmulkes and some challah and some wine. I wanted to make kiddush. And the elderly people looked up, and this is quite a surprise. Out of the darkness comes two Jewish boys, young men. We would have been I was about 26 or 27 maybe. Ben would have been a year younger. So it seemed quite odd to them. Here we are asking, we didn't look particularly Jewish, but we're asking for those things that we'd like to have. And of course they obliged. We had the wine, we had the challah, and I made kiddush. And then while we were beginning to eat our meal, an elderly woman came over to me, and she asked me, do I speak Yiddish? And of course I said, yes, of course, read a bissel Yiddish. And she said, are you from North Sydney? Have you ever been to North Sydney? She asked. Well, I found that a sort of peculiar question. I said, North Sydney, South Sydney. She actually addressed me. She didn't ask Benny. Benny was a smaller build young man. And not that I was tall, but I was taller than Benny. Anyway, she said, she said, do you ever go to North Sydney? And I thought that was a bit peculiar to ask. I said, sure, I go North Sydney, South Sydney. She said, ja bich a mädel for dear, which meant, do I have a girl for you? I've got a wonderful girl for you. And I laughed, and she went back to her friends, and I gave it no further thought. And I think we went to a dance or something, and we went back to Sydney. That was about a week or so before Yom Kippur of that year. It must have been 1957. And not long after, I went to the Central Synagogue on Yom Kippur. Went on Rosh Hashanah, of course, too, but on Yom Kippur I was there. And in the afternoon, early afternoon, it might have been about 2 o'clock, the shul was getting quite stuffy with a crowd of people. And I decided to go for a stroll, which was normal for young people to do. Sometimes they walked to another synagogue and meet some other people, or they just went up and down the street to get a breath of fresh air. Anyway, I was walking along Grosvenor Street, and a friend of mine, just forgot his name now, Ernie Friedlander was walking with a young lady, and I knew Ernie, and I said, hi, and how are you? And he stopped me. He said, Berel, are you going to be going to the JNF Queen Candidate function tomorrow night? I said, no, I don't know about it. Oh, yes, it's going to be a lovely function, and it's not expensive, and it's going to be held, and I forget now the name of the place that he mentioned, but in the city. I said, and he hadn't introduced me to the young lady he was with, but I asked him, who is the Queen? And then he said, Agnes is the Queen, Googie's the Queen. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I said, if the Queen will go with me, I'll be in it. And of course, Agnes was taken a little bit aback, but she didn't mind being asked, but it was a funny way of asking, because I hadn't been introduced to her really. But then he introduced me because he said that Googie was the Queen. I said, well, if Googie will come with me, I'll be in it, I'll come. And she turned around to Ernie and said, do you think it'll be all right that I will go with Berel? Or and Ernie said, of course, Berel's a lovely guy, fine. So, not being able to write down her address, Googie was staying at that time with her aunt in Waverton, and and she said, when you come over the bridge, you turn left at the Weet-Bix sign. And she mentioned the name of the street, which I can't quite remember now. But I was quite excited too. She was a lovely, pretty girl, and seemed very warm and friendly. And to make sure that I didn't miss the street, and to be sure that I'd be on time, after Yom Kippur that day, I drove over with my car and turned left at the Weet-Bix sign, and I could see that I was in the right spot. I could see where the house was. Then I came back. I was confident that I knew where it would be. So the following day, of course, I knew where to go, and I picked Agnes up, and we went to the Queen Candidate function. Well, something happened there that I'd never ever experienced before. I'd gone out with girls before, but I'd never had one that I'd just met who, during the course of the evening, she sat on my knee and she hand-fed me. She took a spoonful or a fork with food, and she put it in my mouth. Oh, I said, I've never had that sort of experience before, but I liked it. And when we went home, of course, I took her to the front gate, and was a bit tentative about giving her a kiss goodnight, but nevertheless I did, and she just very briefly gave me a kiss goodnight and mentioned that there could be more of that, and I sort of took note of that, and of course I was excited about having met her, and we got on so well together. We were laughing and joking all night, and the following day I rang up and I said, well, can we go and have coffee? And within a week, and then of course we went to the theatre the following Saturday. During the week we used to go to a place in the Cross that for 7 and 6pence you could have a cup of coffee, a sandwich, and have a little dance to some music. It was run by Mr. Fisher. I think it was called Silver something, I forget now, in the Cross. Anyway, we used to go out. We enjoyed each other's company, so much so that I really didn't need to go with the crowd as much anymore. We used to spend time playing poker or some card games or going out together, but having found a companion that I was very happy to be with, and when I did see my friends, they said, how can you go out with a girl that doesn't talk? Because Agnes was very quiet in company and was always shy to speak if she wasn't spoken to. Probably she took after her father a lot in that respect. And she was taught, I believe, that if you haven't got anything to say, just keep quiet, don't say anything, So I answered my friends. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't shut her up. She keeps talking to me all the time. And instead of spending time with my friends, I spent time with Agnes. And after a week, I decided this is the girl for me. I'd never met a person who was so warm and good company and enjoyed being with, and we had a lot in common. We liked dance music, and we liked Dixieland jazz and things like that. All the things that I liked, she liked. And a funny little incident was that on the first night, or one of the nights that I took her out, she opened up her purse, and I noticed she had a little cigarette in the purse. I said, do you smoke? She said, no, I don't smoke. And she threw all the cigarettes out. She might have had a puff once, but I don't know, because she didn't want to offend me, and I never saw a cigarette in a purse again. On the one Friday night, not long after I'd met Googie, she invited me over to her Aunt Illa's place where she was staying, because she had difficulties with her stepmother at home, and for whatever reason she was living with her Aunt Illa. Anyway, she invited me home to have a Friday night dinner, and after dinner, well, first of all, I must say that I was very impressed with the dessert that we had. We had these large glasses full with cut fruit, the most exquisite fruit, and I was informed that Agnes had made these, and learnt later that she'd spent most of her wages during that week to cut up the fruit for the family, because each member of the family had one of these as well, but it was specially made for me. Anyway, I could see that she was a good Bollabuster, and Abba always advised me, look, if you're going to meet a girl, never mind whether she's got pimples or she's not that pretty, but as long as she's a good Bollabuster, that's the one you should be serious about. Well, I had a bonus. Not only she was a good Bollabuster, she was pretty, she didn't have pimples, she had all the ingredients that I liked in a girl, and anyway, we on one Friday night, after dinner, we sat down and went through some photographs. And we were looking at the different family members that she was pointing out, this one and that one. In the meantime, an elderly lady came into Illa's home, and I looked at her and I thought, yeah, I've seen this lady somewhere before. It's really quite amazing. I only saw her a couple of weeks ago, and I said to Cookie, who is that lady? She said, that's my grandma. I said, I met her in the mountains. I said, that's the lady that came up to me and said, do you go to North Sydney? You go to South Sydney? I said, that's the lady. So it came out that it was actually Googie's grandmother who sought me out at that to speak to me about her granddaughter. Have I got a girl for you? And that was the girl that I'd met in the street with Ernie Friedlander, that we'd gone out together, and to me it was like it was meant to be. And after a week I proposed to Agnes. Well, I actually didn't propose in the way that she sort of didn't quite hear what I said, because what I said was, Googie, would you like to, do you think we should announce it at the Queen candidate function, when the Queen will be crowned? She said, announce what? And I got a little bit tentative about it, and I kept quiet. I didn't know what to do. So a week later I repeated the question. I was more explanatory about what I had intended, and she said yes. She said she'd love to do that, and so we planned it. And then of course we met with Albert and the grandmother. The grandmother was Grandma Laura, who lived in Beach Road. We went over there for dinner, and I used to bring flowers and so on. I think they were gladioli, because I thought they were big and impressive. And anyway, when I first met Grandma Laura and I walked in with Googie, she looked at me quite suspiciously, and she said, who do I know in Sydney? And having known that she's a religious person, I said, well, I know Mrs. Rabinovich. Oh, you know Mrs. Rabinovich? Oh, yes. I said, I know her very well. And I know Mrs. Schneeweiss. Oh, you know Mrs. Schneeweiss? Yes, I know her very well. And I know Mrs. Falk. Oh, I didn't know you knew. Oh, yeah, I know Mrs. Falk. Well, those three ladies happened to be three of Laura Scheinberg's closest friends. And it didn't take her 5 minutes to ring up on the telephone to either one of them or three of them. Do you know Berel Ginges? Oh, yes, we know Berel Ginges. Well, as soon as I got the passport right, then I was accepted. And, of course, she was delighted that a Jewish boy, who didn't look that Jewish, was courting her granddaughter. And so that's how it happened. Anyway, I introduced Abba to Googie. Googie had actually been up in Rawson Chambers once before, seeking, with some friends of hers, seeking donations for the Queen candidate function. And I wasn't aware, but she sort of kept outside. She was a bit shy to come in. And we were very busy, and I don't know whether we gave them something or not. I can't recall. But later on, when I'd start to go out with Googie, she met with Abba, and he I think he was quite happy that I was going to get married and so on, and but it was a question of where we're going to have the wedding. Well, Googie, as I said, was living with her aunt because she hadn't got on quite well with her stepmother, Similar story to my story, but Albert suggested that he could realise that I didn't have a lot of substance, having worked for ABBA, and the salary wasn't that great, and I wasn't able to save very much. Although ABBA did help out a little bit before the wedding, so Albert asked whether we'd like to have a large wedding or a deposit on a home. Well, of course, both of us being pretty practically minded and not just to get out of our situation of where we were living. I was living at home and she was living with an aunt. We were just happy to be together, and if we had to sacrifice if she had to sacrifice a wedding, it didn't bother me, then so be it. So the wedding was held at the Central Synagogue, the ceremony, the old Central Synagogue, where the late Rabbi Friedman participated. And before that, we had a pre-wedding party. I threw a pre-wedding party at the Ritz in Bondi. I think it's called the Ritz, Ritz-Carlton, or anyway, it was a hotel.
But at the Rex.
At the Rex, the Rex Hotel. And we had a sort of a pre-wedding for our friends, because having decided that the wedding reception was going to be held at my father's home in Bondi, so I was restricted with who I could invite. But I did invite my three closest friends. They were the only three. That was Benny Green, Leon Wise, and Michael Cohen. They were the only three that came to the actual wedding, and we had the violinist who used to play at Grey Eagles, which was the place we used to go dancing. We asked the violinist whether he would play, and he came and he played. And it was a nice little wedding, but it was very restrictive because it was just in the home, just the close family members. And as we were leaving the premise, my dad's premises, to drive to Narrabri Junction, which where we had Albert made available a flat, and he was very generous and allowed us to live for 12 months rent-free in a flat, which we had to share with somebody that was working in New Zealand for him, but we didn't see a lot of him, but nevertheless he had a room there. And but on the way out, Albert asked whether I wouldn't mind giving a lift to Mrs. Falk, a friend of Grandma's. It was a little bit out of her way, and here is a couple going on their honeymoon being asked to give a lift to an elderly woman, which I found a bit odd. But of course, then Agnes Cookie felt it was a bit odd for her that I went to work the following day. There was no actual honeymoon that we went on, and I think Albert was really quite annoyed that I didn't go away. But I had such a responsibility. There was just ABBA and myself, and it was Easter time. It was very difficult to go, and I said, well, maybe we'll go another time. And so the morning after the honeymoon night, I went straight to work. Anyway, after about a year, we were very pleasantly surprised. It was maybe a year and a half. I forgot the year. What year were you born, Danny?
59.
59, yeah. So we married in 58, in March the 2nd, 1958. And Danny was born in May 1959. So Danny was our first born child, and what a thrill it was to say, a boy, you know. It was such a, you know, it was rung up early in the morning. We were living at Bellevue Hill in a unit because the 6 months or year was up that we were living in Narrabri, and the rent was, I think, 11 guineas, and I think my wages were about £25, so there wasn't much for food and things like that. Huh?
Yeah.
Oh, Googie was 21 years of age, and to give her a big surprise for her birthday, I bought her a dozen nappies. I think I must be the only husband in the world that would have been so thoughtful to have bought a dozen nappies for my wife for her 21st birthday. And Albert could see that he wanted to try and help us in a way that would be that we could help ourselves. So there was a property in Flushcombe Road, Blacktown, that he thought might develop into being an extension for Coles, because they were in the other street in Blacktown Road, and Flushcombe Road was parallel or a jutting, and he thought that perhaps they may need that eventually, and so he assisted in us buying it with the hope that that we could capitalise on it, make sufficient capital to begin to earn something for ourselves, because the salaries that I was earning wasn't really sufficient for our needs. And at that time, Albert did call me in and said, look, if the salary that you're not earning is not sufficient, and your dad's business can't carry you, perhaps you should give thought to doing something yourself, and I'll be only too happy to help you if you'd like to do that. So Albert called me in to his office one day, and he said to me, Berel, have you ever written down what your income is and what your expenses are? I think you should do that, and then you'll see whether it adds up, whether it... and I got a shock, because I never really thought about things like whether I had enough or I didn't have enough. Somehow we seemed to make ends meet. Googie was very frugal with the way she spent money. I remember when we first got married, she used to buy tin peaches, which for dessert, which cost 4 shillings a tin. But when she had never asked me how much I earned, and when I gave her half my wages, which was £10, she tried to do the best she could with £10. I mean, which wasn't very much, and so we only had the tin peaches that once. We didn't have tin peaches after that anymore, because it just didn't add up. And to go out at night, we used to just walk down to the local pub, have a shandy, and go for a walk along the beach at Narrabri. There were times where we didn't have a car because it rusted, and I'd had the car 13 years, but didn't have sufficient money to buy another car. And when you think back on those times, how supportive Googie was to the marriage. She was just so happy to be that we were together. And I remember when we went out to Blacktown, we couldn't believe how lucky we were. We had a little dance in the backyard, just jumping around, just with the joy of happiness. But of course, living in Blacktown was quite isolated, and the toilet was right down the backyard where tall grass was growing, and so we had to make do with we bought a potty chamber to put outside the bedroom, because there was no toilet in the house in Blacktown.